Welcome to Litpoetry, the podcast where we go on a journey of discovery, reading, analyzing, and discussing great poetry from around the world. Poetry is worth it because the reading and writing of poetry is a revolutionary act that has the potential to transform both the reader and our world.
Chainsaw by John Kinsella, which first appeared in New Poems Peripheral Light in 2003, is a piece of verse that cuts its way through the dead wood of our all too comfortable lifestyles. Its savage wordplay tearing and ripping a seam across the soft underbelly of our domesticated Western bliss. There are no stanzas in this poem. Rather, the poem uses a trunk-like vertical structure full of enjambed lines that resemble a tree itself, albeit one whose whole and unmolested edges of bark have been chipped and bitten into by the force of a rotating blade of language, or in Kinsella's case by the whirling imagination of his ecologically troubled mind. Living in the wheatlands of Western Australia, John Kinsella is an environmentally focused and celebrated poet, concerned at cultivating language as a tool of political and social discourse and change. A self-acknowledged vegan, anarchist, pacifist and supporter of worldwide Indigenous rights and absolute supporter of land rights, Kinsella writes poetry on a mission, and yet his great respect of the poetic form prevents him from merely churning out didactic poems. Instead, his poems are nuanced, sophisticated, complex and multi-dimensional. And this is not easy to achieve within an art form that, at its best, should stimulate questioning and thought rather than simply steering the reader towards a predictable outcome. Kinsella himself, reflecting upon the challenges of creating non-didactic poetry while still remaining politically true to a cause, has written the following: "Ambiguity in a poem can be the generator of a desire to reconsider, to alter, to question. Activist poetry, specifically poetry that seeks to halt environmental damage, is about clearly delineated outcomes, and yet if the poem doesn't enrich the reader in intellectual, spiritual, artistic or emotional ways, its impact is necessarily diluted or lost. It's not that the activist poem needs to be more than statement, but rather that in being poetry, it will necessarily be many things at once, many versions of itself, at least some of which will be beyond the poet's understanding." Perhaps Kinsella's words here give us an insight into why his poetry has remained so popular and celebrated over the last couple of decades, having published numerous poetry collections and having won many literary awards and prizes. I really would encourage our listeners to check out his work if you haven't already done so. But for now, let's just take a listen to his poem, Chainsaw, before coming back to have a chat to the poet himself. Chainsaw by John Kinsella. The seared flesh of wood cut to a polish deceives. The rip and tear of the chain, its rapid cycling a covering up of raw savagery. It is not just machine. In the blur of its action, in its guttural roar, it hides the malice of organics. Cybernetic, empirical, absolutist, the separation of church and state, conspiracies against the environmental lobby, enforcement of fear are at the core of its modus operandi. The cut of softwood is deceptive, hardwood dramatic. Just before dark on a chill evening, the sparks rain out. Dirty wood hollowed by termites, their digested sand deposits, capillaried highways imploded. The chainsaw effect. It is not subtle. It is not ambient. It is trans-nothing. A clogged air filter has it sucking up more juice. It gargles, floods, chokes into silence. Sawdust dresses, boots, jeans, the field. Gradually the paddock is cleared, the wood stacked in cords along the lounge room wall. The darkness kicks back and the cutout bar jerks into place. A distant chainsaw dissipates. Further on, some seconds later, another does the same. They follow the onset of darkness, a relay of severing, a ragged harmonic stretching back to its beginning, gung-ho, blazon, overconfident, hubristic to the final cut last drop of fuel. Well, welcome, John, to the podcast. It's fantastic to have you on the Litpoetry podcast and to feature your poem, Chainsaw. Before we get to the poem, could you just tell us, our audience, a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I've been a poet most of my life, but poetry has been all my life. It's been the kind of the constituent language, if you like, of how not only I relate to the outside world, but within my family. My mum was a poet. She published a bit before I was born, and for probably the first 6 years of my life. She won a couple of local awards and so on, and it was an important thing in her life. But she stopped writing poetry. She said she stopped writing when she got happy, which was an interesting thing. It's made me ponder what poetry is a great deal. I'm still writing it, and I don't think it's, for me, got anything to do with happiness. It has a different purpose, and I'll talk about that in a second. But it was ever present. I remember when I was 7 years old, my mother reading Milton for an exam. She went back to school, university. I was a mature age student, and I was very small after she divorced, and she specialised in literature. And so, studying Milton and reading Paradise Lost aloud and reading Wordsworth's Prelude aloud when I was like 6 and 7 and 8 had a major impact on me. I heard this stuff being read and I loved it. I listened to it like I listened to a story being told. So the language of poetry was ever present. She ended up becoming a literature teacher. So that there was that as well. And I don't really know any other way. It is the way we communicate in the family. My partner is the poet Tracy Ryan. Our son's a poet as well. He's only 18 and he's starting to publish now, and he's been writing since he was very, very, very small. So it is our chosen medium of communication. So we speak.
So I imagine the conversations around the dinner table and that sort of thing when you get together must be very interesting.
The conversations around the dinner table are mainly about film, interestingly enough. Okay. It seems to be the place we talk about film. This is a big film house as well, and like Tracy and Tim, every week they put an afternoon aside where they watch a movie together, and talk about it and so on. So that's kind of an active part of our life as well. But
there's a connection between the two mediums, really, because both are impressionistic and enter into your space. I mean, poetry does it by words to paint visual images in your mind, whereas the moving image is quite different from that. But can you see a correlation between that?
Oh, there is a correlation, and in fact, I've certainly written quite a few poems on films, and I've written a number of experimental novellas and short novels based around film. So, yes, I can see that. The cinema that interests me in particular, speaking of, it is really expressionist 1920s cinema. I'm really interested in black and white cinema and speaking cinema. I'm very, very interested in stuff from the 1910s and 20s. But, I have a vast interest in diversity in cinema and all things. Everything I'm interested in, James, is about a kind of range. I like looking at a lot of things. And one of the interesting things about making poems is because you're compacting language, you're also able to compact a lot of information. So maybe the most interesting skill in making a poem is if you can bring a lot of information into a line, seem to make it simple, quotation marks, and have its own kind of emphasis, but it has the, a bit like computer memory, it has the ability to pack so much. And poems, I'm a great fan of William Blake, and Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience, they might seem so simple on so many levels, but I've spent a whole life literally trying to work those out.
Yeah, well, Blake is amazing, and he had a very profound association with Milton too. I think he drew a whole lot of...
He did, yes, and I've done a version of, he did a version of Milton, Milton, called Milton, and I've done a version of Blake's Milton, and that kind of way of poet speaking to poet across generations is such an interesting thing,
Yeah, I think it is. So, with your poetry, how are you speaking to generations? Because it seems like you've got a very environmental thrust to your work, and it seems to be you're not just talking to this generation, but you're also thinking about future generations in particular. So it's not just going backwards; it's going forward as well. Perhaps your poetry.
I hope so. I mean, my prime interest and purpose, if you like, in life is trying to rectify some of the wrongs done ecologically, socially, and rights-wise. I consider myself an activist poet. My life is very much based around environmental activism. I'm involved in two kind of, if you like, for want of a better expression, campaigns at the moment, trying to save a forest and trying to save very, very rare bushland in the wheat belt of Western Australia. And that's an ongoing thing. That's really is my life. That's where I've located my life in trying to rectify these wrongs. Poetry for me is a tool in that. As I've said, and as we've sort of been talking about, I've loved poetry all my life. It's the medium I choose to communicate in. I live in a house where we communicate, but for me, poetry in the end has to be useful. I don't see it as a kind of what I call a curatorial artifact or set of artifacts, tools that are on display. I see it as a set of tools you use. It's very active for me. So I'm not particularly interested in a poem lasting into the future. I'm interested in the end results of what the poem does lasting into the future. And that's a kind of different thing. So I write a poem. I want it to be a positive thing in terms of protecting the environment, being active in how we talk about protecting the environment. To be part of that, it's being thought about in 100 years' time as a worthy piece of literature is irrelevant to me. I really don't care about that. What I do care about is that it's active in its time, and its future is the better future brought, hopefully, by intervening in a problem and making it better. So if I write a poem like the Chainsaw poem or the Bulldozer poem, another poem that's used extensively in protest that I wrote some years ago, it's about its ability to make people listen and think about what's happening to the environment and to change the way they behave, hopefully. So that I'm very pragmatic about this. The poem has to actually have a use for me.
Yes. But I actually read something that you wrote, which I found fascinating, because I think one of the downfalls of political poetry, which you named, can be that it can move towards being very didactic. So, a bit one-dimensional, and you're the receptacle of wisdom, and you're sort of lumping people and sort of compelling them to think in a certain way. But I don't think your poetry does that. It's much more nuanced. And I think that's really, really important. I'll read you back a quote that you actually said in this article, and maybe you could comment a little bit about this particular thing. And you said, poetry, it's there not to tell people what to do, but to encourage them to investigate an issue in diverse ways, to find that language compels us towards liberation and a just position regarding the natural world and our relationship to it. The self as a mirror to the biosphere. Maybe we can write a rhetorical lyric, we can rant, but let the poem open those proverbial doors of perception of which we are not even aware when we write. The awareness often comes later. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think that's sort of speaking into what you're saying.
Well, it's kind of key because I don't believe in proselytizing. I don't believe that. I've just got a set of opinions and a set of experiences. I'm no more than that, and I'm not worth more than that. But you know, I do. If a tree's being knocked over, and a forest is being destroyed, it's self-evident to me, and that's really what I'm talking about. It's quite specific. Now, my opinions around how people should behave around these things are purely my opinions. A poem isn't. A poem is altogether more complex than a set of opinions. A poem can have a set of opinions, and I think that when a reader or a hearer or listener or experiencer of a poem goes to it, it's more than it is about mine as the writer of the poem. So there are two things here. First of all, when I write a poem and put it out there, I let go of it. It becomes someone else's, and I have to be aware when I'm writing it, it will be used in many different ways, and not the ways I necessarily, in my opinion, want it to be. So you've got to kind of have an understanding of how language works when you write a poem and know that it can escape you very easily. So when I write, I try and factor in that possibility of change and sort of look ahead and think, well, how might people go with this? And try and widen the range of language so it can do all sorts of different things under different conditions. So that's the first thing. The second thing is a poem is in itself a generator of language. It's part of the whole process of language changing. You know, each generation wants their own set of words. They want their own set of, you know, ways of talking about issues of justice and fairness and so on. And, you know, you get older and you look and think, well, this is the same wheel being talked about. We also wanted this when I was 20. Now people in their 20 want it, and that's great. I think to myself, okay, interesting. What are we shifting here? We're shifting language. And language shift is such an vital part. And to respect language shift, which I do. Someone, a 20-year-old, having a new set of language and ways of talking about problems I was talking about 30 or 40 years ago, is something I totally respect. It's almost, I'm obliged as a poet to understand the transition of language across those decades. Now, when you're writing a poem, you can't know what language is going to be used for 40 years, but you can know that it will be different and that things will change. So there are ways of making poems that allow a kind of dynamism in language that sort of can move with the time. So a poem you wrote 40 years ago will still be relevant now because it's already open to the fact that it's going to change in the way it's read and that language is going to have different meaning in 40 years. So, opinion is only opinion, but, there's justice is justice. And that is a kind that we know what's fair and we know what's wrong. And that remains fairly consistent.
I think you're right. And, things like critical theory have developed a lot of ways of looking at works over time too. So I really get that. I get those shifting perspectives, and who knows what sort of critical lenses will emerge that we're negligent of at the moment.
Exactly.
And I'm sure that will be the case.
Well, it's interesting because I've got a critical book coming out shortly. It's looking at exactly. It's actually saying that you have a responsibility as a writer to understand that you'll be read differently in the future. And then you write to factor that in. You cannot control language. The moment you try and control language, you're actually reducing its possibilities. But at the same time, you have to be conscious and expect it will be read differently. What you're writing now will be read differently. So there's a kind of both an obligation in that understanding. There's also an excitement, James, a kind of liberation in the idea that, that what you write is no be-all and end-all. And this is why that kind of whole hierarchy of good poem, bad poem annoys me so much because, who am I to say? And I'm not the best judge of my own work. I know that. I'm not the best judge of anything in particular. But I do know that change is... there is desirable change, which is the expansion of people's kind of respect and the gaining of more knowledge, all these kind of things. But there's also a kind of bad change, and that is when damage, people's rights are taken, forests are destroyed. And so there's that sort of that conversation that goes on between right and wrong. The old discussion that's been going on since the beginning of time. Poems are about that. They're kind of dialectical things. There is this kind of conversant thing always happening in a poem. They're living entities. They're kind of beyond.
And maybe that accounts for why poetry isn't so popular, because it it kind of demands that sort of attention, which is kind of an uncomfortable place for a lot of people. In a polarized world of thinking, it's not somewhere that people naturally gravitate towards, because it forces that sort of nuanced, difficult engagement, that flux that you have to deal with in trying to grapple with and interpret work, and then hear multiple voices and perspectives. It's a challenge, I think, but an important one.
It is a challenge. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because people, on one level, when they experience a piece of art or, say, a piece of music, listening to the lyrics, a song, they, on one level, expect to be told something. On another level, they expect to be able to use it for their own purposes. So people tend to remember songs that had deep meaning to them at the time they heard them first and things like this. But they also want them to serve a particular purpose. So, a Bob Dylan protest song from the 1960s has to remain a Bob Dylan protest song from the 1960s, when in fact, of course, it can't. Times change. A Bob Dylan protest song of the 60s still has relevance, but its context and meanings have dramatically changed. So you can't ever fix things as you want to fix them, because you've got a nostalgic view of how we remember our past. Poetry is very much about the future, and you said that earlier. You write to the future. Well, I certainly hope I do. I just hope it's a future with, that we can breathe and there are trees and animals and so on. That's my great. That's the future I'm writing for. A kind of a healthy biosphere future, if that's possible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I teach poetry, and one of the fascinating things for me is, and maybe you can relate to this, is that I often get a lot of jaded and unengaged students who their first impression of a poem is negative, but upon discussion in a sort of a class format, if it's done well, they will become lovers of that poem. So it's we are preconditioned to see and read in a certain way, but when other voices come in, they can change our perspectives, which I think is one of the gifts of poetry. And then it can open you said doors of perception. It can actually open new pathways of appreciation that you didn't have before. It creates that conversation. True.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. The thing you mentioned about a group of people, a kind of community of people listening and experiencing poetry.
Yes.
I totally believe that. As a anarchist pacifist, I believe in this kind of gathering of individuals into communities, and I think that poetry is a wonderful way of actually getting a group of people together.
Yeah,
and
it's
sharing.
And it's compressed. You can do it in a session. Together. It's not like a novel or something other form that takes a long time to unpack.
Isn't it amazing how, as I'm sure you have the same experience of thinking about, when we're in school, particularly in a later high school, if you were going through to later high school, where I did literature at school, I was very lucky to be taught by a fascinating educationalist who became an educationalist, prominent educationalist, Bill Green. I went to a rural high school, Geraldton, up the coast of Western Australia. And, I'll never forget the first lessons of literature I had with him, where it was sitting in a circle reading poems aloud. Antithetical class in many ways. People wanted to be out surfing or something like that, or on the tractor or whatever it was they wanted to be on. But the communal thing of poems brought everyone together, and that remained the strength of the class. And I do think that, people have community of poetry through music all the time. They just don't realise it.
Yeah.
My problem is always if you only expect a song or a poem to do one thing, because a song or a poem, especially a poem, cannot just do one thing. It does many things, and if you want to keep it just as that kind of poem or that kind of song, then you're reducing the great possibilities of language. They've got to be living things. Poems are living things.
With the poem Chainsaw itself, just changing focus a bit. So I've read it a few times, and I've been sort of trying to sit with it and think about it. One of the things I really love about it, and I'm not sure if this was partly your intended effect, and maybe I'm just reading my own thoughts into it, but I really feel like there's a real strong, there's waves of consonants and assonance through the poem. So there's a lot of harsh lettering, the gargles and chokes and boots, but there's all these elongated O sounds, so boots and chokes and floods, and I feel like I'm being kind of bashed and strangled at the same time by the poem, because the elongation of the assonance holds me in this grip of destruction, while the letters sort of chip away like the chain spinning on the edges of the wood. Is that something? Am I reading into this, or is that actually something that you're intending through the use of sonics in your language?
In fact, so concretely, so right and accurate are you, is that when that poem was written in its first draft, I was actually in a tense fury because a number of chainsaws were going at the same time down the valley, literally chopping down a copse of trees I'd tried so hard to protect. Now, I could do no more, so I went and wrote that. And interestingly, another poem that does something similar, the Bulldozer poem I've mentioned before, was written during the Row 8 protest. That was written sort of to take back to the protest site and was full of the sounds of the bulldozers. So these aren't poems written at a distance of memory. These are what I would call in situ poems. These were poems written actually in the process of dealing with the issue. So, and where I live now is in the valley, but where Chainsaw was written was in another valley. It's actually all connected to the Avon Valley in Western Australia, but there are lots of little sub-valleys. I'm in a different sub-valley at the moment, but all valleys, things really echo, and there's nothing more horrifying than dueling chainsaws in a valley that that kind of back and forth sound is almost closing in on each other as the destruction kind of meets. And the poem is very much about those sounds and about it actually viscerally, almost invading the body.
Yeah, that's what I got, and that's what I think is so powerful about it. And not only, even visually, and I don't know if this was an intention too. Like there's no particular stanzas; it's just one big, long
run.
And to me, it looks like, I think it looks like a tree trunk almost, and it's being chipped away at the edges. And maybe that's not what you're intending as well. But
oh no, that is.
It is okay.
Well, I shape all my poems. If you have a look across all the poems, they're either going. In fact, I do a lot of concrete shape poetry too. But a poem should always, I think, physically represent the basic kind of structure of what you're doing. I think if you're doing 4-line stanzas or 3-line stanzas, or you're using 14 of a sonnet, the shape of it should actually replicate the language being used and what the language is trying to represent. So you think about cinema as well. That's that kind of what you capture on the image is there for you. It's representational, but when you add the sound to it and the light effects and so on, you're almost shaping it in a different way. These things are very sculptural. The poem is a sculpture in many ways.
We are coming back full circle
we are.
Yeah, theatre.
We are. And I think we maybe have to, because all these things are interconnected. And, poems, as it says in the Chainsaw poem, about the organic, is that the chainsaw, which is inorganic, destroying the organic, is also caught in this kind of organic process of human rapacity. And the interesting thing to me in the poem is the chainsaw is an object. Humans have made the object. They use the object for all sorts of things. This object also connects with, a whole kind of empirical discussion about, materiality and spirituality, and where the two do or don't link. And objects in my poems very often are sharply delineated against the background of the spiritual, which in some ways maligned or destroyed or damaged by the object. So any consumerist, any industrial kind of usage always becomes an antithesis in my poem to a spiritual choice.
Yeah, there's that metaphorical edge. I can see those ideas sort of bleeding out of your language that way. Are you a bit of a fan of the Images Carlos Williams?
How can you be a sort of modern poet without, of course, and actually interestingly, not just the more prevalent images, but even ones who are slightly maligned these days, like Amy Lowell or something, I find quite interesting. And and I'm no fan of Ezra Pound because of his politics. But, when you think of the station poem and that little glimpse, faces on the wetback, that amazing moment, an image can capture so much. What a poem to me often is a series of sound connections between images that allow ideas to flow. You can build the ideas around those. I often, when I'm walking around in the bush and so on, and I'm outside, I kind of go through a process, conscious or unconscious, of almost gathering images. You are gathering images. As you expose yourself to the outside world, you're kind of exposing yourself to series, almost cascades of images. It's an interesting process, and not one you can willingly control. It just happens.
Yeah, but when you write with those images, you preserve the dignity of the reader, because then they have to put the pieces together and they go on that journey, which is lovely.
They do. Surely we respect our readers, and we think the reader has their own set of images and experiences they've gathered, and they can almost fill in the gaps and go with it. I've got a great belief in the reader. I believe much more in the reader than the writer. I always have. I really do. I think that the greatest art is to be a reader and a listener, an experiencer. We can all create. All of us can create. We all can. But not all of us wish to actually put the time in and listen and read in maybe the way we could. So I have a great respect for the listener and the reader and the experience, as I say, because poetry is such a visceral thing. You can feel it through your body. You don't even have to see or hear it. You can almost feel its physical vibration. It's a very physical thing, poetry.
Yeah, it's a marvellous thing, isn't it? It's probably a good place to finish because we're leaving our audience on a really good note, because they are creators in this process of poetry. When they read well, when they open themselves up to those experiences, they are the artists, which is a lovely thought to finish on, I think. John, maybe?
They are indeed, James, and I've enjoyed talking to you. I wish you a good day, and I say hello to your listeners, and this is a good experience. This is what it's about.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's about creating a community as well. So thank you, John. So it's time to finish up this week's podcast and say goodbye. I really hope you enjoyed our interview with John Kinsella and our discussion of his poem Chainsaw. Let me leave you with this thought. The chainsaws in Kinsella's poem only cease their activities at night, but there is an ominous sense of their relentless tomorrows, which, of course, are our tomorrows. The chainsaws are us, and they will go on ripping into the world until all its resources are used up. We really need to do more to change this situation. While we always have the capacity to act like chainsaws, we still retain the choice on whether we fill our tanks with selfish desires that fuel destruction, or whether we even pull the cord to start the chainsaw in the first place. I'll see you next week. Chainsaw by John Kinsella. The seared flesh of wood cut to a polish deceives. The rip and tear of the chain, its rapid cycling a covering up of raw savagery. It is not just machine. In the blur of its action, in its guttural roar, it hides the malice of organics, cybernetic, empirical, absolutist, the separation of church and state, conspiracies against the environmental lobby, enforcement of fear are at the core of its modus operandi. The cut of softwood is deceptive, hardwood dramatic. Just before dark on a chill evening, the sparks rain out. Dirty wood hollowed by termites, their digested sand deposits, capillaried highways imploded. The chainsaw effect. It is not subtle. It is not ambient. It is trans nothing. A clogged air filter has it sucking up more juice. It gargles, floods, chokes into silence. Sawdust dresses boots, jeans, the field. Gradually the paddock is cleared. The wood stacked in cords along the lounge room wall. The darkness kicks back and the cutout bar jerks into place. A distant chainsaw dissipates. Further on, some seconds later, another does the same. They follow the onset of darkness, a relay of severing, a ragged harmonic stretching back to its beginning, gung-ho, blazon, overconfident, hubristic to the final cut last drop of fuel.
You've been listening to the Lit Poetry Podcast, presented by James Laidler. For more podcasts, poetry videos, and other useful resources, visit our website at www.litpoetry.com. Thanks for listening.